This is In the Room, the Connecticut Mirror's regular series of in-person conversations with Connecticut political leaders. I'm John Dankosky, and today my guest is Senator Richard Blumenthal. Now, before we get started with our conversation, I want to thank the generous financial supporters of Connecticut Mirror's event series. Our presenting sponsor, Eversource, amplifying sponsors, CBIA and the Mohegan Tribe, publishing sponsors, CLA, Express Strategies, Hinckley Allen, Rowthorne Law LLC, and the Causeway Agency. As always, I would like to thank the people that support Connecticut Mirror by making donations online. If you go to ctmirror.org, there's a donate button in the upper right-hand corner. I always talk about this, but it's very important to know where that is. Between now and December 31st, all new gifts are being matched dollar for dollar, up to $5,000 per gift. This is how you support nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism, and thank you for your support. Now, we're sitting in the room together at West Hartford Town Hall in the offices of West Hartford Community Interactive. We want to thank everyone from their team here for putting together our live stream tonight. And I'd like to thank Richard Blumenthal for coming in and joining me today. Thank you so much.
And I'd like to thank you for having me, John.
Well, I'm glad we got together. So we were supposed to talk several weeks ago, and this was during the government shutdown. You were kind of trapped in Washington. There's a whole bunch of stuff about the shutdown that I want to talk about in terms of policy. But just talk to me about what was happening there. Like literally, you were supposed to come here. We were going to do an interview. You had stuff to do in Connecticut, but you were like held hostage in Washington. What was going on?
Well, I hesitate to say held hostage.
Those are my words, not yours.
So many really terrible images.
Yes.
But we were stuck.
You were stuck, okay.
And the reason we were stuck is that Republicans were calling votes again and again and again on the same piece of legislation, namely what they called a clean CR. Mm-hmm. We called it a dirty CR. CR stands for continuing resolution, yes, which was funding to continue the government. Since there was no continuing resolution, the government was shut down. And their idea of a clean funding proposal was no health care. My reaction, and we were pretty unified as a caucus, as Democrats, was no health care, no agreement on the funding proposal.
Okay, and that lasted for quite some time, and that's what happened. And then some commentators have said that some Democrats in your caucus, the words used are caved, folded, laid down, rolled over. They said more unpleasant things. What exactly happened with these 8 folks? What conversations did you have with them about their decision to say, okay, government shutdown's over, we need to make a deal here?
Well, I will come right to the point, John. I was disappointed and angry that Republicans forced this false choice on us, an impossible choice between reopening the government and affordable health care. And the promise they made to the 8 who decided to go along with their continuing resolution was that we would have a vote on continuing the health care subsidies or tax credits. And that wasn't good enough for me. In fact, it was downright unacceptable because I was totally unwilling to go along with a vague promise to have a vote at some point in the future on an undefined bill. Now, just so folks understand what's at stake here, these health care subsidies are necessary for thousands of people who buy their insurance through open enrollment in the Affordable Care Act. In Connecticut, it's known as Access Health Connecticut, to buy health insurance. And the prices, premiums, are spiking, double, triple, sometimes quadruple. People in Connecticut are forced to pay literally $20,000 more for this health care insurance. No more insurance, same plan, but just they're charged more because the subsidies aren't there. And because we're limited in time, I won't give you the long-winded answer. Unusual for a senator not to be long-winded.
We have a whole hour, really, I mean.
But essentially, there's a ripple effect throughout the insurance industry so that everybody is affected. Everybody pays more because the sickest people have to get insurance. The invincible young people who feel nothing's going to happen to me won't buy insurance because of the increases in price. So there are fewer people to make possible the premiums that support health care insurance for everyone. Anyway,
Yeah.
this decision has real life consequences for real people right now. And during the time we were taking these votes, people were looking at open enrollment and saying, my goodness, or something with a few more expletives,
Yeah.
I can't afford this health insurance. I'm going to have to take the risk that I get sick. And I was getting calls from people in
bad.
Connecticut, thousands
Yeah.
of people who were going to be without health insurance. So it wasn't just that I felt it was wrong, inequitable, morally, just plain dead wrong, but also that people in Connecticut were suffering these much higher premiums in real time then. And the Republicans were saying, oh, we can wait. We'll do it at some point in the future. But first of all, there was no trust. I don't trust Republicans. And second, people can't afford to get sick on Donald Trump's timetable.
So isn't part of the problem, though, that these subsidies were temporary in essence, right? That they were never codified in any way to be extended beyond this period anyway. I mean, isn't that one of the failures here of previous Congresses to not actually make sure that these things are here and not basis to some sort of political infighting around the budget?
Your point is important, that the American Recovery Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, that extended this subsidies, put an expiration date of the end of this year on them, which frequently happens. In fact, it's probably more frequent than not that government programs go for a period of time, then they have to be reauthorized. So that's not too unusual, but you know, the point here is these subsidies were expected to be wildly popular. And guess what? They are wildly popular. And you know where most of the people who benefit from them live? In red states that Donald Trump won. 3/4 of all the people who will pay more as a result of ending these health care tax credits live in red states that Donald Trump won. So Republicans are literally hurting their own constituents more than they're hurting Democrats. But your point is well taken. You know, if we had maybe been more farsighted in 2023, we would have said in perpetuity sounds good, and maybe it would have passed, but that too was a compromise.
Because I know a lot of things like this, they do have time limits, and I know that they do sunset over time, but here's another popular plan that people like, Social Security, right? I mean, we don't have to reauthorize Social Security every couple of years. There's a reason why certain things are built into sort of the American fabric, because people need it. People need to have health care. So looking forward, right, if Democrats get back in control of both houses of Congress and the presidency, do you actually make it so that people have health care, not for 2 more years until the next continuing resolution, but actually for the next 20, 30, 100 years?
If we were in charge, and maybe we will be in 2026.
You were a couple of years ago, but go ahead, yeah.
If we are,
Yeah.
no question that we will try to adopt a more permanent solution. But talk about Social Security for a moment.
Yeah.
Another hot topic, yes, it is going to exist, just like the Affordable Care Act will exist. It doesn't have a sunset date.
Yeah.
It's these subsidies or the tax credits that have the sunset clause. And by the way, Social Security has to be reformed so that people are really provided for after they are 65. The cost of living is increasing. The cost of living allowance has to be increased, and Social Security may be insolvent unless we reform it by eliminating some of the exemptions for people above certain incomes. So every program has to be adapted to the needs of new generations, and in this instance, the Republicans are saying at most that they might. You remember Donald Trump over the weekend said, okay, we'll extend the subsidies for a couple of years. And he was immediately deluged by his right wing with criticism. So I think you have to recognize that we're up against MAGA here.
Do you think that there will be a vote?
I think there will be a vote, and unfortunately, I think Republicans will be bludgeoned into voting against health care tax credits extension.
Okay, so years ago, and it seems like such a long time ago, I mean, you have supported a so-called Medicare for all concept in the past. A very different way of looking at healthcare than we have right now. Let's just forget all the stuff that we're talking about in this world that we're in. Help build a better system right now. What does it look like now that you've been through all of this stuff in Congress over these years? What sort of system do you think the American public really want from you that will give them health benefits at a reasonable cost that won't break their bank?
I've supported Medicare for all from day one. When Bernie Sanders helped to lead it, I was literally by his side at the announcement of it, and helped to lead it in the Senate. It wasn't going to get through the Senate or through the House, but basically Medicare for all makes Medicare available for everyone in this country. Insurance should be available at really affordable rates, not just for people
more affordable than
over
60. The ACA is currently even, right?
More affordable than the ACA. As everybody knows, the costs of health care are spiraling upwards, so we need to deal with health care costs. And in some sense, I've said to my colleagues jokingly, you know who's getting off easy here is the insurance companies. And as you know, I have a history with insurance companies of going after them when I was Attorney General. I've gone after pharmaceutical drug companies for monopolies and using the patents and other kinds of anti-competitive measures when they are improperly used. So I'm not a friend of monopoly or anti-competitive practices in healthcare. I think we need to bring the cost down, because there's an argument, and it has some validity, that the more money you throw at healthcare, the more the healthcare companies, both insurance and pharmaceutical drugs and medical device companies and others in the industry, feel they can raise their prices. So I think we need to do something about healthcare costs. Medicare for all is, I think, the ultimate objective, but we're moving in the right direction. We have passed a bill as part of the time when we were in the majority that permits negotiation of Medicare drug prices for everyone, benefiting everyone. And so the nation has followed Connecticut in putting a cap on insulin prices. But we need fundamental reform in healthcare. And I think we need to do some stuff to reform Social Security. That's why John Larson and I, he in the House and I in the Senate, have championed a measure that would provide for greater security and solvency in Social Security.
One thing that I'm sure some of your constituents watching this right now would say is, okay, Senator, how do you pay for a Medicare for all program? How does that get paid for by the American public? What does it cost us?
Well, surprisingly, we don't have to write on a blank slate here, because other countries in the industrial world have this kind of health insurance. We pay tons of money more for pharmaceutical drugs, for example, than other countries do. And only recently have we had any success in enabling importation of those drugs at the prices that are more affordable and using those prices. So part of it is lowering costs. Another part of it is, no doubt, using the borrowing power of the government to finance health care in the way that we do with Social Security, maybe some kind of trust fund. There will have to be some kind of allocations, appropriations, year to year. But I think the investment in health care to bring down costs, to make it more affordable, something the American people really want, just like they want lower prices for electricity, for groceries, for rent, for mortgages, for all of the American costs of living right now.
Speaking of which, something else that sort of came out of the government shutdown was it really showed the tenuous position of SNAP benefits for so many Americans who rely on food assistance. How do we get to a point where this isn't held up again? We were talking about, the budgetary games or every 2 years. What I think we saw was people lining up and saying, look, I'm not going to be able to afford groceries right now. How do we safeguard SNAP?
John, all of these questions are very rational, perceptive, and important.
That's sweet of you to say.
We are living with an administration that is cruel and stupid in a lot of what it does. So you're asking me, what do we do? Well, what happened with SNAP was totally unnecessary. Literally. The reason why we had this crisis in SNAP was because Donald Trump wanted, purposefully and intentionally, to make this shutdown as painful as possible. And I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but anybody watching this situation knows there was no reason to suspend the SNAP money. In fact, it was illegal. And the courts told him it was illegal. And at first he said, I'm going to follow the courts. And then he said, no, I'm not going to follow the courts. Then he said, well, we're going to make sure everybody gets their SNAP money. And then he cut it off completely. And here is the plain stark truth about America today. People are going hungry. I don't use the term food insecurity. I think it's kind of a euphemism that makes people maybe feel a little bit better about it. Hunger is what kids are experiencing today in America. And during the shutdown, when I came back to Connecticut, and I did come back on a couple of weekends, I went around to the food pantries. I went to one today, literally, a veterans food pantry in Wyndham. And the shelves were almost empty because veterans had come for food. Think of it for a moment. Our veterans have to go to a food pantry for food because otherwise they would go hungry. Something is wrong with this picture. Children going to bed hungry in America. And 1 out of 8 people depend on SNAP. In Connecticut, it's 1 out of 10. SNAP provides for 42 million people. These numbers I know don't mean much, but go to the food pantries. Talk to folks there. On Thanksgiving, there will be lines for people who want turkeys. And many of them are people who never before asked for anything.
But and I guess the reason I'm asking some of these questions about just the frameworks, the guardrails, and I have a bunch more because there's a lot of stuff that frankly Democrats can't do right now because of this administration. But what I'm asking you to do is think about like a world that we could envision that we don't have to worry about this. And I think that's one of the questions. If we know that 42 million Americans are, whether you call it food insecure or hungry each year, we need to find a way to get them fed. And relying on the mechanisms that we have right now for this to be part of a budget that is a political instrument, it doesn't seem to work. So what better way, Senator, do you think we can arrange this so that this doesn't come up every 2 years or whenever?
Well, it's a little bit like the debt ceiling. There's no reason that we have a debt ceiling. Every time one side or the other wants to get rid of it, the other side objects. I think we need to come together. We're talking here like parties, Democrats and Republicans will never get together. Every day I go to work on internet safety for kids, on AI and chatbots, on Ukraine. I try to find common ground, and I do. And often it is against big tech or lobbyists, the conglomerates and the giant corporations, the billionaires who are getting tax breaks. How do we deal more effectively? We don't have tax breaks for billionaires. We don't have $4 trillion. We're not talking about billion, we're talking about $1 trillion in tax breaks. I know a lot of folks are probably tired of hearing us talking about tax breaks for billionaires, but it is a fact of life that we have to make choices. Budgets are blueprints. They reflect our values. You want an effective SNAP program? You want effective health care? You don't cut a third of all the Medicaid recipients. Connecticut, fortunately, is in a good fiscal position. The governor, to his great credit, committed he was going to provide for the SNAP benefits, even if the federal government cut off. But those red states, no way. And so how do we expand these social safety net programs, or at least provide some security? We make choices that don't involve tax cuts for the wealthy who don't need them, and help the middle class. And if you remember nothing else that I say tonight, my great fear is that we are, in effect, eviscerating our middle class. We're making it so hard for people who go to work every day, maybe two people in the family, some of them having two jobs, and they are struggling to make ends meet, literally struggling to make ends meet. And it isn't only tariffs that are raising prices. It isn't only the cost of living. It's the fact that there is a grinding disparity between people who make moderate incomes and the people at the very top, the top 1% or top 10%, who are doing so much better. So yes, we have to change our tax policy. No tax breaks for the billionaires. And that's what we saw in the great, big, beautiful bill. I call it the great, big, blatant betrayal. Choices that were wrong for America. And by the way, increased our national debt, which I find abhorrent to that degree, that our national debt, our children, our grandchildren, now will have to pay for that kind of irresponsibility.
I'm just going to jump ahead because we got some questions from people who read the Connecticut Mirror. And Al from Southbury said, most economists feel the national debt is one of the greatest economic threats to our country. For many years, neither party seems to do anything to reduce this debt, saying that the other party is the problem. What specifically should be done to reduce the debt and not just the annual deficit?
Well, let me point out, first of all, that our governor has reduced pension debt here. And the way he's done it, and the only way to do it, is to be responsible in spending and taxation. So the answer to that question, is it Al who asked it?
It was Al in Southbury.
In Southbury.
Good old Al.
I don't know Al, but I'd love to meet him. Because remember, Al, I talked about the debt before I heard your question.
Yeah.
And the way to do it is to end those tax breaks. Because they are siphoning off literally trillions of dollars. We're talking about billions of dollars for SNAP. Mm-hmm. In the tens of billions. There's a big difference between those tens of billions and the trillions of billions, the trillions of dollars that are involved in the tax breaks. We have to be responsible. And I'll never forget, John, I just want to tell you this one story. I first went to Washington and as a United States Senator. And I was asked to do an interview on one of the cable shows. It was during the day, I don't know, 1 or 2 p.m. And I went on the show and I said, we really need to reduce our national debt. And I got back to my office and there was a call from the majority leader, Harry Reid at the time. Mm-hmm. And he said, don't talk about reducing the national debt. He said, we need to have some flexibility here. And I said, Senator Reid, I really think we need to get the national debt under control. And when Bill Clinton left office, there was no national debt. And I think President Obama, he was the president at the time, can do the same. And sure enough, President Obama talked about reducing the national debt. Republicans may talk about reducing the national debt, but look at what they did on the tax breaks for billionaires.
Yeah. I could talk about that stuff with you for a while, but there's so much to get to. I do want to ask about something that's, I think, pretty disturbing. Both you and Senator Murphy have been pretty vocal about the president's statements about Democratic lawmakers who encourage military personnel to reject any unlawful orders, essentially saying, you don't have to obey orders that are unlawful. It's part of your job. Among other things, the president said that these statements were seditious behavior punishable by death. And he's also launched an investigation, the Pentagon has, into Mark Kelly, one of those senators. First, I'm just wondering if you could describe your reaction to the president using those specific words. Seditious behavior punishable by death.
Well, I was just aghast. I would have been astonished, but it is President Trump, so we're accustomed to hearing pretty astonishing things from him. But my second reaction was urging physical violence against a member of Congress is exactly what we don't want. And then I thought about the reaction to Charlie Kirk killing, when all of us agreed we need to lower the temperature. Let's cool the rhetoric. And here, without talking about the kind of messages I receive, I knew that those colleagues were going to be deluged with hate and threats of violence, and that it would ripple throughout the United States Congress, because there is a group out there, and frankly, it's on both sides. Extremist violence is one of the greatest threats to the stability of our country. In fact, you know, there was a point where I received the intelligence briefings on threats to this country, where they shifted from fears about extremists from outside the country to extremists within the country. And this is not limited to right or left. Political violence today is a real threat. So, number one, totally irresponsible to talk about it that way. But then to talk about Mark Kelly. You know, I've gotten to know Mark Kelly because I've worked with Gabby Giffords on gun violence prevention, but also because Mark is on the Armed Services Committee with me. We've done a number of initiatives together. I've gotten to know him personally. This guy is a hero. He fought in Iraq. He piloted planes when he was shot at. He launched 4 or 5 times as an astronaut. He retrieved the remains of the Challenger victims. He is someone you want your kids to take as a role model, literally. And he's a wonderful, thoughtful friend. And I thought about just the atrocious audacity of anyone challenging his patriotism, but then urging that he be hung, and then the Department of Defense beginning an investigation of him. Remember what he and the others did? They simply said, you have a right not to obey an illegal order, which is actually one of the first principles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that the newest recruit is taught. Now, you know, they could have gone farther. I think they did in one sentence and said, you must disobey an illegal order, which is really the way it's put to you. Oh. And we've been through enough cases of torture, of the My Lai massacre, to know that troops are held responsible when they fail to disobey an illegal order under extreme circumstances.
I do have to ask, though, because so much of everything that comes out of the administration now, but just honestly, almost everything that seems at issue in government ends up in the courts. It's very hard to know, frankly, what an illegal order would be if I was a troop. If I was serving in the military, I wouldn't know what's an illegal order and what's not. And I think that puts people in a very dangerous position legally, doesn't it?
It does, and very few members of the military, in fact, I don't recall one except for in My Lai and some of the torture cases, where it is, you know, just so blatantly clear that the order is illegal. I think a prosecution would be very, very difficult to do and probably unjust to do for the reasons that you just described. But I will tell you that a number of my colleagues have raised this issue with respect to the strikes on those boats in the Caribbean that supposedly are carrying fentanyl. We have no idea what they're carrying, who is running them, where they're going, who is ultimately responsible for them. And I'll tell you, John, I have reviewed the classified Office of Legal Counsel memorandum that supposedly justifies these strikes on the boats. And I came away very disappointed and dissatisfied. I'm a lawyer. I did litigation for a long time. I was Attorney General of the state of Connecticut. I was the U.S. Attorney of Connecticut. I've been in the courtroom for a while. And my feeling is that memo should be released to the American public. So people can judge for themselves the legality. And I, in fact, led a group of my colleagues, all of us Democrats on the Armed Services Committee. We just released the letter to the Secretary of Defense asking that Office of Legal OLC memo be released to the American public. So to answer your question, there are legal questions here that the American public deserves to know, and frankly, the troops deserve to know in executing those orders.
I'm glad you brought that up. That was the next thing I was going to talk about. Anyway, I guess I'm wondering, so you say you can't talk about what's in that memo because it's a classified memo. You are hoping it's unclassified so that we can all see it. What can you tell us about what you know about these strikes? Do you think that these are legal?
I can tell you what my impression is, that the rationale given so far publicly is inadequate, based just on what has been publicly disclosed. I can't talk about what is classified, but I will say one more thing, which is that there is a lot of factual material that could and should be declassified. And I go to these classified briefings all the time, and often at the end of them I say, you know, China knows that we know this stuff. They know what we know. We know they know. The only ones who don't know are the American people. And so a lot of what is classified could be declassified. I can't do it unilaterally.
Yeah.
So I can't answer your question, basically.
Oh. Another way, I guess, of getting at this question is, if you begin to strike at supposed drug traffickers operating in waters that are not off the United States, and then you bring in the leader of Venezuela, the president of Venezuela, say that he's the head of a cartel and that this is all an action against a drug cartel. Is this, in your mind, is this an act of war? Is this something different? What exactly is this?
So far, in my view, and I'm just talking about public information,
Sure.
there have not been acts of war against Venezuela, but there have been potentially violations of international law in essentially killing people without a legal justification that's been articulated publicly. What's been happening is, and by the way, let's be very clear, I'm against drug dealing. I'm against drug trafficking. I'm against drug importation and drug running. And the way to deal with it is the way we've done it up to now, which is we send the Coast Guard to interdict these boats, maybe supported by the Navy, but we don't just blow them out of the water. We arrest them. Now you can say, well, that doesn't do any good because we're just arresting the lower level people, and we should deter them by blowing them up. Well, it hasn't deterred them. They're still doing it, maybe because they're coerced to do it, or maybe because they're paid enough that they'll take the risk. We don't know. But the point here is that we have to stop the drug trafficking. And by the way, it's not fentanyl, which comes from Mexico. It is mostly cocaine that's going to other Caribbean islands or to Central America. And you can say, well, from there it goes into the United States. Maybe, let's do a better job at the border. Let's stop the drug trafficking at the border. And let's also stop the illegal immigration. I have been in favor of border security, since first going to the Senate. Border security can be achieved, but I always advocated the use of technology and surveillance and more resources, not necessarily a wall.
You teed up another question from one of our readers, which I appreciate. James from Hartford wrote, Why didn't Democrats move to close the border or limit crossing long before crafting a border bill? Did Biden and Democrats actually believe Republicans would agree to a border bill that would have hampered a Republican return to power? This is something I've talked with Chris Murphy about quite a bit. I know I've talked with you about a bit about, but what do you have to say to James about that?
Well, just so John is aware, I took the position on border security before you asked the question, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's the answer
Yes.
to your question. In 2014, I believe it was 2014, I was in the United States Senate and on the Judiciary Committee, and we negotiated an immigration reform bill.
Yes.
I don't know whether you remember it, but it was bipartisan. John Cornyn and I and other members of Judiciary got together, and we actually hammered out a bill in the Judiciary Committee that provided a path to earn citizenship for undocumented people who are here, 11 million at the time. We provided for more visas, agricultural visas, as well as H-1B visas for industry and manufacturing. We provided a number of reforms to the asylum process to eliminate the backlog of asylum claims and provided more resources for judges. And by the way, we provided for border security. How do we do it? Allocating tens of billions of dollars. Some of our friends didn't like it, but we felt we had to do border security. And we have felt all along we had to do border security. And the reaction, I think, of the Biden administration, let me be very blunt, was to some of the excesses in the Trump administration, like family separation, some of the cruelty in the first Trump administration, which have only been magnified now with the unidentified ICE agents, mass throwing people into unmarked cars, separating families in some instances. But border security has been a position that I have consistently supported, and other Democrats have as well. So to John. James, sorry.
Yes, that's okay.
Border security has to be part of immigration reform, and it's not unreachable. What happened to that bill that we negotiated? It passed out of the Judiciary Committee with bipartisan support, and then guess what? It passed the United States Senate with more than 60 votes, bipartisan measure. What happened in the House? It never got a vote. One of the greatest tragedies of the last 15 years that I've been in the United States Senate is that immigration reform could have been achieved 10 years ago, and the opportunity was lost because John Boehner, then Speaker of the House, would not give it a vote because the Boehner policy, and I think it was the policy of speakers generally in the House, that they would not put on the floor measures that needed Democrats to pass. And, you know, it was a historic lost opportunity.
I want to loop back to your work in the Armed Services Committee, and we were talking a little bit about Venezuela and the drug boats, but you did mention Ukraine, and there's been a lot of movement, and I don't know if you have any sort of update for us as of right now on what the status of this Ukraine deal is, because over the course of the last 24 hours, it seems to have shifted quite a bit and potentially gotten support from Ukraine.
This 28-point plan was a total anathema. What it required was that NATO membership be barred, that Ukraine's military be decimated, that foreign military presence in Ukraine be banned. It was a dream proposal for Putin. You know, there's a lot of speculation that Putin actually wrote it and gave it to Steve Witkoff, the president's envoy for everything, and that he then presented it as a fait accompli to the Ukrainians, who rejected it. Not only Did Ukraine reject it? Europeans rejected it. And, you know, I have worked in a bipartisan way. I've been to Ukraine 8 times since the beginning of the war, almost always with Lindsey Graham. He and I are a very unlikely couple because we vote differently almost all the time. But on Ukraine, we have forged a bipartisan relationship, a partnership that has produced a Russia sanctions bill with 85 co-sponsors, bipartisan, both sides of the aisle, 85 co-sponsors. Doesn't happen too often for measures these days in the United States Senate. So the answer is this 28-point plan was always going to be rejected by Zelensky, and rightly so, because it involved surrender of territory that Putin hasn't taken yet, and Ukrainians are going to defend with their blood, as they have defended all along. And Zelensky said it well, the surrender of the country's dignity or ending a partnership. Fortunately, they have been negotiating, and some of the more antithetical points have been deleted, which means Putin won't accept it. Let's be very clear. Putin does not want peace. If he did, he would have accepted a ceasefire well before now. Remember, Donald Trump said, Putin has to accept a ceasefire. You know, and then Anchorage came along. And then he reversed himself. And then he said there has to be a ceasefire. He's been back, and President Trump has been back and forth. Bottom line, Putin has been stalling and stonewalling. He's been playing the United States. He's been playing us for a sucker. And what we need now is a show of strength, because only strength will bring us peace, only strong support for Ukraine with more Tomahawk missiles, more ATACMS long-range artillery, more F-16s, more of the Patriot missile interceptors that will help protect against the missiles and drones that Putin is sending. I've been there when they were under attack, when the sirens sounded and we had to go. It is a frightening place to be, and Putin is slaughtering children, women in their homes, in schools, in hospitals. It is merciless, a reign of terror from the skies, and obviously Putin is committing war crimes. He's been charged with war crimes, and we need to be strong in favor of Ukraine. This 28-point plan, now reduced to 20 points, may ultimately produce some agreement between the United States and Ukraine, but if that happens, it probably will not be agreed to by Putin.
The actual reality of that sort of military investment from the United States to support Ukraine, what do you see that possibility as?
John, you know who's paying for the military aid going to Ukraine? The Europeans. The Europeans are paying for arms coming from the United States, manufactured here, benefiting our corporations. Europeans are paying for them. That was the deal that Trump worked out. Remember, he said, I'm stopping all the arms shipments, and then they persuaded him, you know what, we got a deal for you, Mr. President. Europeans will pay for them. Now, the Europeans are saying, very rightly, that the seized Russian assets, we have hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian assets that are in European banks, most of them. We have some in American banks. And I have a bill that would essentially use those Russian assets to pay for American arms bought by the Europeans and then transferred to Ukrainians. The Europeans have stepped up in a way that is very inspiring. You know, I've met with Zelensky, I don't know, 20 plus times all over the world, not only in Kyiv, but also in Rome, in Paris, with Europeans as well as here. Europeans know what is at stake here. If Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, he will keep going. His aggression will be aimed at Poland, at Estonia, at Latvia, at Lithuania. They know it. They've lived under Russian rule. They have no illusions about what Putin's strategy is here. He wants to restore the old Russian Empire. And what we're watching here is a slow motion Munich of appeasement. Appeasement never works. And if we haven't learned that from history, we are dumber than I think we are. And again, Putin wants a ceasefire about as much as he wants to go swimming in a Siberian lake in the middle of winter. And for anybody to think otherwise, I have the Neville Chamberlain Award for you on appeasement.
Let me quickly switch gears to something. I can't believe we've made it 50 minutes into our conversation without asking this. What is the substantive result, do you believe, in the release of the Epstein files?
The substantive result?
Yeah. What happens now?
What
does it
happens
matter?
now
Yeah.
is the Department of Justice will do everything it can to avoid disclosure. And we will do everything we can to force disclosure. And when I say we, I mean myself on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation. I'm the ranking member there. And we have a number of methods and tools that we can use to force some disclosure. We can go to watchdogs or whistleblowers. We can insist on disclosure from the Epstein estate. We can go to the Treasury Department. And my feeling is what we need to do is follow the money, because Epstein invested on behalf of a lot of rich and powerful people who in turn have information. And so one way or the other, what happens now is disclosure, which the Act provides. And my hope is, John, that we'll have bipartisan agreement that the Epstein files have to be made transparent, because the ones who are most insistent on it are the right-wing MAGA types who think there's this pedophile conspiracy, and we ought to let the chips fall where they may. There'll be some bold-faced Democrat names as well as Republicans who may be part of the files. They may not be implicated in doing anything wrong or criminal. They may just have, been with Epstein on a social occasion, had their picture taken with him, but all of it should come out.
Well, what's the most important part to you about everything coming out? Why does it
The
matter
most
so
important
much?
part to me is the survivors. They are the heroes here. They are the reasons that this legislation passed. They are the reason why Trump reversed himself. Instead of opposing it so staunchly and steadfastly, he completely reversed himself because he knew that the discharge petition in the House would be passed. And the reason is because the survivors were so powerful. I've met with a number of them, as are survivors in any instance of sexual abuse and domestic violence. I've done cases, legislation involving the Olympics, victims of abuse, and I've dealt with the survivors there and others, and their faces and voices demand disclosure. And if nothing else happens, the reason why I believe that there will be full disclosure is that the survivors will insist on it.
This week, 2 criminal cases brought by the Department of Justice into former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James were thrown out by a judge. These cases are seen by the 2 defendants, of course, and a lot of legal scholars as being vindictive prosecutions of political enemies. Traditionally, the DOJ just doesn't take orders from the White House on who to go after, but legally, can it? I mean, the Department of Justice has historically acted independently, but it doesn't have to, right? It can take marching orders from the president who says, I want an investigation in that Dick Blumenthal.
The norm and the tradition has been that it doesn't. And when I was the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, by the way, we wouldn't even talk to political people. I wouldn't take phone calls from them. I didn't go to events even indirectly involving them. I was out of politics for 4 years. I couldn't go to the most benign political event. And it was not a bad life. But more important, I just had no political influence from anyone. And that was true of the Justice Department then. And then, of course, we went through Watergate. when in fact Nixon had his enemies list, and people found it abhorrent that our Department of Justice would be directed politically, and the tradition was restored. In fact, there were laws passed that protected against disclosure from the IRS, even to the Justice Department. So, John, what we're seeing now is the most kind of flagrant abuse of that tradition and norm. Theoretically, the president could say, and he has said, go after so-and-so, regardless of the evidence. But here's what happens. The cases are dismissed.
But this is why I'm asking, and the sort of theme of the evening here has just been about like putting safeguards around these things, because I think as you talk about it being abhorrent or about norms and traditions, I think that a lot of people are looking at this like, well, if this isn't the way it should be, is there some way in which we can put safeguards around this so that we actually have in perpetuity an independent Department of Justice, and we don't have to worry about whoever the president is being able to go on a witch hunt?
There is. And in fact, I have proposed a bill with Dan Goldman, who was a member of the House of Representatives and a former prosecutor like I am, and also one of the impeachment lawyers. You may remember seeing or hearing him. He and I have proposed a bill that would essentially prohibit these kinds of contacts between the White House directing the Justice Department. We also proposed a right of action for abusive prosecution. Connecticut has one. Other states do too. If a prosecutor is off the rails and goes after someone because of personal animosity or political opposition, there is a recourse for someone after that prosecution is done and there's an acquittal. And that same kind of deterrence ought to be present in the federal system. It has other provisions, but the answer to your question is yes, there are guardrails that can be imposed, and they should be. I'm very clear-eyed. There is not a chance that we're going to have this legislation adopted any more than my legislation on the Insurrection Act that would prohibit the use of military troops against American citizens without some congressional review. There are a lot of measures where guardrails and safeguards should be imposed that we will not see in this administration.
That we won't see in this administration, but I guess that I'm asking you for the future here is once again, sometimes Democrats have had control of all three important levers of government, and these guardrails still aren't put up. And I guess I'm just wondering if this is something that you think can and should be done in the future.
Yes to both.
Okay.
It can be, it should be, and if I have anything to do with it, it will be, as you may have gathered from some of my response. I have a bunch of legislative proposals that I've helped to lead as a member of the Judiciary Committee. We don't have bipartisan support for them.
Yeah.
I'm under no illusions. I've been in the Congress now that I've heard Republicans talk a good game privately and then fall into line publicly because they are so fearful of primaries supported or launched by Donald Trump. But I'm hopeful I'm going to be there, that the people of Connecticut will see fit to keep me there, and that we can lead this effort, because these guardrails are one of the lessons, one of the clear lessons, just as in the aftermath of Watergate, we established some guardrails.
We just have a couple minutes left, and I've got a couple questions I want to ask you, so I'll ask you to go through these quickly. But I do have to ask about a bill that you recently announced to expand federal background checks to all gun sales. This is obviously an enormous issue here in Connecticut. Explain exactly what this would do and how it would bolster current U.S. law.
Very simply, Chris Murphy and I have been working on this bill for a very long time. I was working on it as Attorney General back in the 1990s, and he and I have been working together to expand background checks to unlicensed sales, that is, sales by people who are not licensed gun dealers. Right now, the background checks apply if you go into a gun store where the owner is licensed, but the private sales at gun shows or other kinds of ways are not covered by these background checks. We'd expand the background check coverage. Very important. It was not done in the Safer Communities Act that we managed to pass a few years ago. There were other reforms that did pass. They have worked. Background checks in Connecticut cover those sales more expansively. And Connecticut has shown that good, responsible gun prevention, gun violence prevention, actually works. It saves lives. And I am fighting very hard, by the way, for the Ethan's Law that we passed in Connecticut, named after Ethan's song. Very important to have safe storage of weapons. And by the way, you know, among the victims of gun violence, little recognized, are veterans. I'm the ranking member on the Veterans Affairs Committee, really proud of it. Fighting the cuts and the firings and the furloughs that are inhibiting provision of services to our veterans. This Veterans Administration leadership has engaged in unnecessary and actual counterproductive cuts in, for example, the Veterans Crisis Line that helps to save veterans when they are threatening to take their own lives by guns often. If you provide for safe storage, you can save veterans' lives as well as others.
My last question for you. Do you and your family have Thanksgiving traditions?
We have a Thanksgiving tradition of everybody who is able to come will come.
Is it to your house?
Well, it used to be in another family's house when we were first without children, then we had young children, and then the tradition has passed on, and we're going to have Thanksgiving in our house. We did last year and I think the year before.
Do you cook?
No.
No, have you ever, do you ever cook anything for Thanksgiving? You don't have a special thing?
When I was in law school, a group of us had a tradition that I was at Yale Law School, we were in New Haven, and I was one floor of a 3-story house, and we had a tradition of having Thanksgiving for the 3 years we were there. Each of us did a different dish. I did apple pie.
Oh, nice.
Which is actually pretty easy to do, but I'm not trusted with the grave responsibility of doing it these days in our household. I have other tasks which are more labor intensive and skill oriented.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a great cook. I can do rudimentary stuff, but the answer to your question is my wife is a great cook, and this is an area of responsibility that she will simply not entrust to me.
Do you have a favorite dish? Is there anything you'd like really look forward to? Thanksgiving table?
I love the vegetables.
Yeah.
You know, I love the turkey. I love all of it. The
whole thing.
Actually, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you were actually able to make it back to Connecticut for Thanksgiving after being in Washington for such a long time. Senator Blumenthal, always good to see you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Have a great Thanksgiving.
I really
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of the folks here who helped us do this at West Hartford Community Interactive, based in West Hartford's Town Hall. Thank you to the entire team here. Thanks to everyone at the Connecticut Mirror. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, Eversource, our amplifying sponsor, CBIA and Mohegan Tribe, publishing sponsor, CLA, Express Strategies, Hinckley Allen, Rowthorne Law, LLC, and the Causeway Agency. Before I go here, the Connecticut Mirror, just like a lot of nonprofit, nonpartisan media, needs your help, especially right now at the end of the year. It's a big time, and there's a matching dollar-for-dollar pledge. It's up to $5,000 per gift. It's part of a big end-of-year celebration of media. Click the donate button on ctmirror.org. This news match is very, very important. Please think about how important nonprofit, nonpartisan media is to you and support it, especially this time of year. Thanks to everybody at the Connecticut Mirror for making this happen. I'm John Dankosky. Join us next time for In the Room.